This is a guest essay written by Blake Flayton, a columnist living in Tel Aviv and co-founder of the New Zionist Congress.
I don't know if you've ever been to a local Nakba commemoration. Nakba, Arabic for catastrophe, a term originally coined by Syrian intellectual Constantine Zuraik to describe the Arab world's failed 1948 attempt to annihilate Israel. But these events today exist largely to reassure Palestinians, and especially their admirers abroad, that they too have had a Holocaust. The rhetoric surrounding the 1948 Palestinian displacement is increasingly and intentionally shaped to elicit not only sympathy, but reverence, as though it represents a moral singularity akin to the Holocaust. But while the Nakba was traumatic, it was not historically unique. In the broader context of 20th century upheaval, marked by mass expulsions, ethnic partitions, and genocides, it stands as a painful chapter. Harsh, yes, but not anomalous. Yet that context doesn't fit the script at the NGOs and dialogue groups who speak in hushed tones of shared trauma and bridging the gap, where Holocaust and wartime displacement are weighed on the same scale. Displacement, it must be said, that could have been avoided had the Arab world accepted a Jewish state and absorbed the refugees. As Israel's first UN ambassador, Abba Eban, put it in 1958, responding to the grotesque comparison between Israel and Nazi Germany, quote, "It is a monstrous blasphemy." Professor Arnold Toynbee takes the massacre of millions of our men, women, and children and compares it to the plight of Arab refugees, alive, on their kindred soil, suffering certain anguish, but of course possessed of the supreme gift of life. This equation between massacre and temporary suffering, which can easily be alleviated, is, I think, a distortion of any historic perspective. Would Eban be surprised to see how little has changed? The bludgeoning of Israel with appropriated Jewish trauma is a textbook case of Holocaust envy, a modern phenomenon in which the singular destruction of European Jewry is softened, relativized, and eventually rendered fungible through comparison to any number of tragic but fundamentally distinct events. In the context of Israel and the Palestinians, it becomes a form of psychological revenge, a way to get back at the Jews if you're pissed at them. As Israeli writer Shani Moore put it, quote, "Hauling the Jews in to plead their case before a special tribunal and face the charge that they are the real Nazis has been the fantasy of every anti-Semite since the first gavel hit a sound block at Nuremberg." Holocaust envy is not an accidental feature of anti-Israel rhetoric. It is essential to it. It reverses the Jews' historical role from victims to villains, thereby erasing the moral justification for Jewish sovereignty, especially when one subscribes to the popular lie that Israel exists only because Jews were victims. Strip them of that victimhood, and the state can be morally liquidated. The charge of genocide against Jews serves a second purpose. It soothes Western guilt. If the Jews are now the perpetrators, not the victims, one no longer has to wrestle with the memory of what one's grandparents did or failed to do during the actual Holocaust. In this light, it becomes very easy to ban Jewish students, Zionists, from campus groups. And this is where the discourse of the day rears its head. This week, millions of Israelis stood solemn and still outside their cars, homes, and office buildings as a siren wailed through the country. The 27th of Nisan, Thursday, marked the Day of Remembrance of the Holocaust and heroism. In Israel, this day not only commemorates the unfathomable loss, it honors the courage of those who resisted, most famously during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which began on April 17th to April 19th, 1943. And yet, true to the psychological mechanics already described, the anti-Israel movement cannot help but make even this hallowed day about themselves. In the magazine Jacobin, so-called journalist Joseph Mogul published a piece rebuking both the Jewish people and the broader world for supposedly failing to learn the quote-unquote real lesson of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, made clear by Israel's current war against Hamas, which he calls a genocide. October 7th, in Mogul's framing, was not a massacre. It was, rather plainly, the Palestinian Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. But October 7th was not the Palestinian Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and what followed it is not, and has never been, a genocide. To understand why, we need only turn to Mogul's own summary, quote, "A second round of deportations, begun on April 19th, 1943, the day before Passover, sparked the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising." Correct, hundreds of young Jewish fighters, poorly armed, barely trained, composed of Zionists, socialists, and Zionist socialists together, understood they had no future except death. Their choice was not between autonomy and occupation. It was between the gas chamber and a gun. Their imminent demise was not dependent on or predicated upon a Jewish army warring with Nazi Germany. They were to be murdered because they were Jewish. Contrast that, if you would, with Gaza. No Israeli soldier has ever marched into Rafah to deport Gazans to crematoria. Since Israel's full withdrawal from Gaza in 2005, including all military personnel and civilian settlements, it has only re-entered the Strip in response to indiscriminate attacks from Hamas, and to those who point to the post-2005 blockade as evidence of unprovoked oppression, perhaps exaggerated to the extent of Gaza is an open-air prison, or, of course, a concentration camp. Your reversal of cause and effect is staggering. Israel blockades Hamas. It does not blockade Gaza without cause. October 7th was not a Palestinian equivalent of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. It was its inversion. In 1943, the Jews fought because they had no choice. Hamas is fighting today because they believe Israel should not exist and that Jews should be no more. That simple difference is the hallmark of a war, not of a genocide. The violence is conditional, contingent on the decisions of an armed actor. The Jews of the Holocaust had no such option. Their genocide was not dependent on any army laying down arms or meeting political demands. No one represented the Jews. No one sat across from their murderers at a negotiating table. There was no ceasefire to be won. They were to be annihilated, categorically, because they were Jews. The Armenians were to be killed because they were Armenians. The Tutsis were to be killed because they were Tutsis. The Cambodians had no infantry aimed at Pol Pot. Bosnian Muslims had surrendered and were still murdered, much like Native American tribes during their genocide in the 1800s. They were murdered because of who they were, not because they were threatening to destroy another party. The Palestinians are experiencing a tragedy because an army that governs their territory refuses to release hostages and lay down their arms against the Jews. There is no comparison between that scenario and a genocide. None. I found it almost amusing that, near the end of his Jacobin essay, Joseph Mogul only briefly acknowledges the inherent differences between the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and October 7th. He wrote, quote, "Palestinian resistance to this colonialism has at times inflicted violence against Israelis, including on October 7th, 2023, when Hamas fighters killed 1,181 people, among them 736 Israeli civilians. At least 14 Israelis were also killed by the IDF's use of the Hannibal Directive. Conversely, Jewish resistance during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was against German soldiers, not Catholic Poles, who were most often onlookers. This is textbook Holocaust envy, to minimize Palestinian actions that led to conflict, to gloss over, to compress the Hamas-led massacre of October 7th into a single sentence, in service of a false analogy to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Instead of recognizing Palestinians as people with a stake in their future, people with agency, the discourse insists on casting them as permanent victims, often by way of Holocaust envy. I'd wager this conflict would be closer to resolution if the Palestinians were treated like adults, not as people being herded into extermination camps, but as a people being asked to live next to Jews rather than instead of them. Until that truth is acknowledged, every comparison to the Holocaust is not just historically bankrupt, it's obscene.